The desert doesn't forgive carelessness. It doesn't forgive noise either. Not the kind that comes from engines, and not the kind that comes from people who talk when they should be watching. The Mojave understood this. The Rock understood it. The canyon, 17 kilometers north, understood it better than anyone. Private First Class Kara Voss understood it best of all. At 05:45, 40 minutes before the first light touched the ridgeline, she sat alone in the back corner of the staging vehicle with a field tablet balanced on her knee. The screen was dim. She'd turned the brightness down to almost nothing, the particular adjustment of someone who doesn't want to be noticed doing what they're doing. Canyon Route 7 North, satellite imagery, thermal overlay from 48 hours prior. She studied it the way a surgeon studies a chest cavity before the first incision, not with urgency, with precision. Her finger moved slowly across the screen, tracing the canyon walls, reading the rock the way other people read text, the natural ledges, the shadow lines, the places where the terrain created geometry that had nothing to do with accident and everything to do with intention. 4 positions. She circled them with a red stylus. 1 at the eastern wall, 2/3 up. 1 below it, 8 meters down, tucked against a natural break in the rock face. 2 on the western wall in a mirror configuration, staggered for crossfire coverage. Pre-planned, patient. The kind of placement that takes time to arrange and confidence to hold. She stared at the 4 red circles for 11 seconds. Then she closed the program, powered down the screen, and slid the tablet into her cargo pocket. She picked up her notebook from the seat beside her, opened it to a fresh page, and in the pale gray pre-dawn light filtering through the vehicle's scratched window, she began to sketch the canyon walls from memory. The ledge positions, the road, the angles, the distances she'd calculated from the satellite data against terrain elevation maps she'd cross-referenced 2 nights ago on a personal device, using database access that technically should have expired 11 months ago. Nobody had revoked it, probably because nobody knew she still used it. She drew 4 X marks. Outside, Fort Irwin National Training Center was beginning to wake. Diesel engines turning over, boots on gravel, the flat, functional sounds of an Army staging area coming to life in the California desert. 3 weeks she'd been here. Long enough to know the rhythms, long enough to know which sounds mattered and which ones didn't. Nobody had knocked on the vehicle door. Nobody had come to find her. Nobody knew she was there. That was the point. Master Sergeant Earl Briggs had been in the United States Army for 28 years. He had served in conditions that would rearrange most people's understanding of what human beings were capable of enduring. He had watched men with decorations fail and men without them succeed. He had learned, over the long accumulation of those years, to read people the way you read terrain, not from what they showed you, from what they didn't. He was 58 years old. His face had the quality of country that had been through weather. His hands were steady in the particular way of someone who had been required to keep them steady under circumstances that made steadiness difficult. He did not speak often. When he did, people listened, not because of his rank, but because in 28 years he had never once said something that didn't need saying. He had noticed Kara Voss on day 1, not because she stood out, because she didn't. And there was a significant difference between a person who failed to stand out because they had nothing to offer and a person who failed to stand out because they had decided not to. The second kind was rare. Briggs had encountered it perhaps 4 times in his career. Each time, it meant something considerable. The way she walked told him things. Terrain awareness in every step, not performative, just present. The constant, low-level mapping of a person who had spent years moving through places where inattention had consequences. The way she positioned herself in any room, always with sightlines, never with her back fully exposed, but casually, the same way a man checks his watch in a room full of people without announcing that he's checking it. The way she listened during briefings, not to the words, but to what the words revealed about the speaker's assumptions. 3 weeks. She had given him nothing confirmable, just data points, just the accumulated weight of small observations adding up to a conclusion he couldn't yet name but recognize the shape of. At 0600, 15 minutes after he found her absent from the morning lineup, he went looking. He found her in the staging vehicle. She didn't startle when he opened the door. She looked up with the measured attention of someone who had heard him coming from 20 feet away and decided to let him arrive. Briggs climbed in, sat across from her, said nothing for a moment. Outside, the desert light was beginning to change. That first gray softening before the sun arrived and made everything harsh and certain. Route 7 North, he said finally. Canyon choke point at kilometer 14. What do you see? She looked at him. 3 full seconds, not evaluating the question, evaluating whether he was the kind of man who could handle the answer. 4 positions, she said, not 3. Briggs held her gaze. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise, something closer to recognition. The particular feeling of a calculation resolving exactly as you'd suspected it would. He nodded once. Then he climbed out of the vehicle. The door closed behind him. He walked back toward the staging area without looking back, and he did not tell anyone what she'd said. Some things needed to stay in the place where they were useful. For now, that place was his own head. Major Diana Holt arrived at 07:15. She arrived the way officers arrive when they've spent enough years making entrances that entrances have become involuntary. The dust adjusted. The junior enlisted straightened without being told. The air in the staging area organized itself around her presence without anyone deciding that it should. She was 43, angular and lean in the way of someone who had never once treated their body as anything other than a tool required for performance. 4 combat deployments. A chest full of decorations that represented not politics, but actual time and actual places where the cost of failure was denominated in lives. Her reputation operated in advance of her by approximately 5 kilometers in any direction. You knew what Major Diana Holt expected before she said a word, because everything about the way she moved announced it. She dropped her kit on the map table, studied the layout. Her eyes moved with efficiency, not drama. Team status: Alpha Mobile, Bravo down 1 vehicle. Staff Sergeant Garrett Monroe delivered it clean. Fuel resupply in progress. Who's handling it? A pause. New transfer, ma'am. Holt's gaze moved across the staging area, found Voss at the fuel line. 2 seconds. A single assessment, the kind that happens faster than conscious thought. Then she looked back at the map. Certified? On paper, ma'am. On paper. She said it without inflection and did not look at Voss again. That was the entirety of it. 2 seconds. 4 words. And then Kara Voss ceased to exist in Major Diana Holt's operational awareness, filed somewhere beneath fuel inventories and route intel, and the 15 other things requiring a commander's attention before 0800. Voss watched this happen from 40 meters away. Her expression didn't change. She picked up the next clipboard and kept working. The briefing was at 800, 12 personnel under canvas in the hard morning shadow of the equipment shelter. Holt stood at the front with a map display and the compressed cadence of a commander whose words had worn grooves in her throat from repetition. Clear, flat, precise. Convoy route is Route 7 North through Sector Green. Choke point at kilometer 14, canyon approach, 2 lanes, no maneuver room. Intel assessment is cold. We move at combat speed, stay tight intervals, through before midday. She looked at Monroe. QRF on standby, 30 minutes out. We won't need them. Specialist Beaumont, quiet and thorough, confirmed rear security from the 3rd row. He was the kind of soldier you only noticed when you needed him, which in itself was a form of professional excellence. Specialist Wesley Pruitt confirmed Vehicle 2 status with the economical precision of someone who drove the way other people breathed, without announcement, without variation. The team ran through its confirmations in sequence, each voice adding to the operational picture Holt was constructing. In the back row, Voss had a small notebook on her knee. She was writing, not fast, not with visible urgency, just steadily, the way you write when you've already thought something through and you're committing it to paper before the details begin to soften at the edges. She did not raise her hand. She did not make eye contact with anyone. Holt noticed. Voss, every head turned. Voss looked up without hurry. Problem? No, ma'am. Then put the notebook away. She closed it, set it in her cargo pocket, looked straight ahead. The expression on her face was not embarrassment, and it was not resentment. It was something that had no obvious name. The expression of a person who had assessed the comment, weighed its relevance, and filed it somewhere below the threshold of things requiring a response. Briggs, standing at the far edge of the group, watched this. His face showed nothing, but behind his eyes the calculation continued its quiet work. After the briefing, while the team broke into motion and equipment checks, and the organized noise of people preparing to move, Staff Sergeant Garrett Monroe fell into step with two of the junior enlisted. Monroe was 34, broad, confident in the way that comes from being right often enough that you stop questioning whether you might be wrong. He was good at his job within the boundaries of what his job normally required. Outside those boundaries, he had not yet had occasion to discover his limitations. He spoke in a volume slightly louder than necessary. Transfer came in with a demotion and no explanation. He didn't look at Voss. He didn't need to. That's either criminal or incompetent. Either way, not exactly what you want on a canyon approach. Two of the junior enlisted laughed, the kind of laugh that's more about belonging than about something actually being funny. The laughter carried across the staging area. Briggs heard it. He had been checking the restraints on the second vehicle's equipment load. He stopped, turned his head slowly in Monroe's direction. He didn't speak. He didn't move toward them. He simply looked at Monroe with the full, unhurried attention of 28 years and 400 things he'd seen go wrong when people underestimated the wrong person at the wrong moment. The laughter stopped, not because Briggs had said anything, because of what his silence contained. It was the silence of a man who knew something the room didn't and had decided that the room would find out on its own schedule. Monroe looked back at him for a moment, then looked away, returned to his equipment check with slightly more focus than before. Briggs turned back to the restraints. Across the staging area, Voss had heard the laughter. She continued writing in her notebook, her pen moving at exactly the same pace as before. Not faster, not slower, the same pace. The convoy rolled north at 08:45. 6 vehicles, standard interval. The Mojave stretched flat and blinding on both sides of the road before the terrain began to change, rising gradually, the ground becoming more complicated, the rock pushing up through the sand the way old things push through when the surface wears thin. Voss was in the second vehicle with Pruitt. Pruitt drove with both hands on the wheel and his eyes exactly where they were supposed to be. He was not the kind of person who asked unnecessary questions. This was a quality Voss had identified on day one and quietly noted. There are people you want beside you in a vehicle when the variables start multiplying, and Pruitt was that kind of person without knowing that he was. The radio ran standard comms checks. Every unit confirmed in sequence. Voss confirmed last. Clean. Flat. The response from Holt's vehicle came back without acknowledgement. Thumb off the transmitter. Nothing personal, just the arithmetic of command operating as it was designed to operate. The canyon walls began to rise at kilometer 11. Voss had been watching the ridgeline since kilometer 9, but at 11 it became necessary. Not obvious, just necessary, the way certain things become when you've done the math, and the math has arrived at an answer that requires your full attention, regardless of what else is happening around you. The rock rose 15 meters on both sides, fractured, dark. The kind of terrain that collected shadow the way a pool collects water, holding it in the folds and breaks where the sun couldn't reach. Good cover for someone with patience, bad terrain for someone trying to maneuver. The geometry of the place had been selected by someone who understood both of those things. At kilometer 12, she leaned forward. Slow down. Pruitt glanced at her. Orders are 15 clicks. Do it. He hesitated 1 second, then eased off the accelerator. The radio crackled immediately. Holt's voice, sharp and flat. 27, close interval, maintain speed. Voss put her hand on the console. Gently. Fuel irregularity. Minor. Tell her. Pruitt transmitted it. Holt copied. Voss went back to the ridgeline. At kilometer 13, she opened her notebook. Not to write, to confirm. The sketch. The 4 X marks. The angles she'd calculated from the satellite imagery, cross-referenced and verified. She looked at the sketch, and then at the rock, and then back at the sketch, running the comparison with the focused attention of someone checking a map against territory they're already standing in. Her jaw tightened at kilometer 13.4. She keyed the secondary tactical channel. 27 requesting 10-second hold, ma'am. Upper ridgeline, I have a... Holt's voice cut across her. Hard. Final. Not cleared for tactical requests. Keep moving. That's a direct order. Voss released the transmitter. She looked at Pruitt. His eyes were forward, hands tight on the wheel, the focused expression of a man who had decided that whatever was happening around him, his job was to drive. When we stop, Voss said quietly, passenger side wheel well. Fast. No questions. Pruitt nodded once. Didn't ask. The first shot came 4 seconds later. It was a ranging shot. Lead vehicle, passenger quarter panel. The canyon caught the sound and multiplied it, threw it off both walls simultaneously, turned a single report into something that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, in the inside of your own skull, all at once. Then the second round hit the road surface 8 meters ahead of the lead vehicle, and the convoy stopped. Contact, upper ridgeline, Monroe's voice, loud and clean and immediate. Multiple positions, east and west walls. Personnel poured from vehicles. The disciplined chaos of trained soldiers going to ground, finding cover, establishing sectors. The canyon walls watched all of it from above, with the patience of things that had been waiting. Voss was at the wheel well before the vehicle finished rocking. Pruitt hit the ground 3 seconds behind her, eyes wide, looking at her with the expression of a man who has just understood that the person beside him had known this was coming and had said so and had not been heard. She didn't explain. There wasn't time. She pressed flat against the vehicle and looked up at the eastern wall, and she began to count. Not the shots, the intervals, the rhythm between them, the specific, identifiable pattern of a trained shooter managing a firing sequence under operational conditions. The pauses that told her not just how many positions were active, but where each one sat in its reload cycle, and how long that cycle took, and what could be accomplished inside the gap. The notebook was open in her left hand. Her right hand held a pen. She was already writing. 43 seconds. She would time the interval 3 times to confirm it. Then she would know exactly when the eastern wall went quiet, and for how long, and what 7 seconds of silence could accomplish in the hands of someone who had already done the math. The canyon walls rose above her, patient, certain, waiting. Voss looked up at the ridgeline and did not look away. Somewhere behind her, on the tactical net, Major Holt's voice moved through the smoke and the sound of incoming fire, issuing commands with the clipped authority of a will that would not break under pressure. She was fighting hard. She was fighting smart. She was fighting the right battle in the wrong terrain, and the terrain was winning. On a frequency that no one else in the canyon knew existed, something was about to change everything. Voss watched the ridgeline, counted, waited. The canyon did not forgive carelessness, but it had no mechanism to account for preparation. The canyon had its own acoustics. This was the first thing they taught you about confined terrain, about any fight conducted inside geometry that belonged to the ground rather than to you. Sound behaves differently when walls are involved. It bounces, it layers, it arrives from directions that have nothing to do with where it originated. A trained soldier learns to discount the first impression of incoming fire, to look past the sound to the physics underneath it. Most of the team was working from the sound. Voss was working from the physics. She was flat against the passenger side wheel well of the second vehicle, notebook open, pen moving in the small, controlled way of someone writing under conditions that would make most people's hands shake. The rounds overhead were not aimed at her current position. She had calculated that in the first 11 seconds. The eastern wall's angle of fire covered the road surface and the lead vehicle's position. Where she was, pressed against the vehicle's flank, was inside the shooter's minimum depression angle. Not safe, survivable, which in a canyon under active fire was a meaningful distinction. She was on her third timing sequence, 43 seconds, confirmed twice, now the third. The eastern position too had a rhythm, not sloppy, not amateur, consistent. And consistency in a firing pattern is information, the same way a heartbeat is information. You can read it if you know how to listen, and if you've spent enough time in places where reading it correctly was the difference between two outcomes you didn't want to think about too carefully. 38 seconds, 39, 40, 41, a pause, 42, 43. The rate picked up again, exactly on schedule. 7 seconds of reduced fire from that position on the 43rd second. Not zero, reduced. But 7 seconds was a very specific quantity of time if you knew what to do with it. And Voss knew exactly what to do with it. She wrote the number down and circled it twice. Specialist Wesley Pruitt was pressed against the vehicle beside her, his rifle covering the angle she'd pointed him toward when they first hit the ground. He was doing his job without being asked to explain why the woman beside him was writing in a notebook while people were shooting at them. This quality in him was, at this particular moment, invaluable. 40 meters back behind the lead vehicle, Major Diana Holt was in motion. Holt moved with the low, compressed efficiency of active fire management, crossing open ground in bursts that minimized exposure, going from position to position, reading her team, adjusting fire commands, trying to reshape a situation that was not responding to reshaping. She had directed suppressive fire to the two confirmed positions on the eastern wall. For 45 seconds, it appeared to have some effect. The rate of incoming dropped. The team shifted posture, just slightly, the collective body language of soldiers who think the corner might be turning. Then the rate climbed again, new angles, tighter. The eastern wall had either repositioned or reinforced, which meant either the enemy had moved or there had always been more of them than the initial contact suggested. Either possibility pointed toward the same conclusion, which was that the suppression model Holt was working from was built on incomplete data. The road was covered front and rear. The canyon walls offered no lateral movement. Communications were degraded by the rock itself, the canyon acting as a signal shadow that swallowed transmissions and returned partial acknowledgments. The QRF request had gone out twice. Both times, something less than a full confirmation came back. Holt was fighting with everything she had. It was not enough. Not because of her, because the ground had been chosen specifically to neutralize everything she had. Specialist Cody Halloran took a round through his upper left arm at 0937. Through and through, bone intact, the round exiting cleanly through the back of the shoulder. He went down behind the third vehicle and expressed himself at length, while Specialist Beaumont got a field dressing positioned, and Monroe applied pressure with the focused efficiency of a man who had done this before. Halloran was going to be fine, but he was bleeding, and the field dressing was going to need support it wasn't currently receiving, and the canyon was still firing, and the situation had acquired a weight that was pressing down on everything. At 0939, the Tier 1 frequency opened. Not the tactical net, not the convoy channel, the other one. The frequency that required an authentication sequence that wasn't in any manual, accessible to anyone in this canyon, because the manual it lived in had a clearance level that did not correspond to a staging area at Fort Irwin on a Tuesday morning in September. Voss heard it and did not hesitate. She reached for the secondary handset with the economy of motion that belongs to people who have been expecting exactly this, and who have therefore already completed the internal calculation that most people would still be running. 27. Kestrel Actual. Confirm call sign. She pressed the transmit key. Iron Wolf. The canyon was still firing. The tactical net was alive with Holt's commands. Nobody in the immediate vicinity should have been able to hear a conversation on a separate frequency at low volume through the noise of active contact. Monroe heard it. He was 7 meters away, managing Halloran's dressing, and he heard it the way you hear certain things when your nervous system has been calibrated by years of training to catch specific categories of sound regardless of the surrounding noise. The call sign, 2 words, and something in the configuration of those 2 words, in the way Voss said them with the flat, professional certainty of someone who had said them many times before, went through his operational processing and arrived somewhere he hadn't anticipated. He went very still. Not the stillness of cover, the stillness of a man whose understanding of a situation has just been revised without his permission. He turned his head slowly and looked at Voss, 15 meters away, in cover behind the equipment mount of the 3rd vehicle. Master Sergeant Earl Briggs heard it too. He closed his eyes. 1 second, maybe 2. Then he opened them and looked at the eastern ridgeline with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a particular thing to happen and has just watched it happen, and who understands that what comes next will determine everything that follows. Kestrel Actual's voice came back, measured and formal. We have your position. Canyon approach, kilometer 14. 4 hostile elements, pre-placed. Eastern and western ledges. Confirm. Confirmed, Voss said. Execute contingency Black Frost. Authorization, Kestrel Actual. Time sensitive. She set the handset down and opened her notebook to the canyon sketch. Major Diana Holt covered 40 meters in 5 seconds, staying low, crossing the open road with the particular efficiency of someone who has made peace with the arithmetic of exposure. She arrived at Voss's position and stood above her, and the expression on her face was doing several things at once, in a compressed space that had no room for any of them. Who is that? Voss was looking at her notebook. Command, ma'am. What channel? Tier 1. A silence between them that had nothing to do with the incoming fire. What is your call sign? Holt said it carefully. Not a question, a measurement. Voss looked up. Her eyes were clear and steady and entirely without apology. Iron Wolf. Holt's jaw tightened. The geometry of her face shifted in the specific way of someone confronting information that requires significant internal reorganization while standing in an active kill zone with no time for reorganization. Stand down. I'll take the handset. That is a direct order. The radio opened again before either of them moved. Kestrel Actual's voice came through at a volume calibrated, perhaps deliberately, to be audible to more than one person. Iron Wolf. Kestrel Actual confirms command authority. Execute Black Frost. Time sensitive. Acknowledge. The canyon was still firing. Halloran was bleeding through his field dressing. Pruitt was watching the angle Voss had assigned him with the focused attention of a man determined to be useful. The team was pinned, suppression was failing, and the road in both directions was covered. Holt looked at the handset, then at Voss, then at the notebook in Voss's hand. She looked at the notebook for a long time, not because she was hesitating, because she was reading it. The sketch. The 4 X marks positioned on ledges, not the rim. the trajectory lines drawn from each position to the road surface. And beside the eastern wall, two columns of numbers, timestamps, intervals, a pattern recorded in real time from the first shot, showing with mathematical clarity the reload cycle of the eastern positions. 43 seconds, 7-second window. She had been timing their reloads since the first round hit the canyon wall. She was reading it now the way she had read every battlefield she'd stood on, looking for what the facts said rather than what she'd expected them to say. And what the facts said was unambiguous. The woman crouched against the wheel well of a second-line vehicle had been preparing for this specific situation before the convoy left the staging area, had identified the positions from satellite imagery, had calculated the sound corridor, had timed the reload intervals under active fire while maintaining cover, while maintaining composure, while appearing to any observer as simply another soldier doing what soldiers do when the ground starts shooting at them. This was not the work of a private first class. This had never been the work of a private first class. Holt stepped back, one deliberate step, making space. It was not surrender. It was operational reality, applied in real time by a commander who had spent 20 years learning that the hardest version of leadership was knowing when to step back and let someone who knows more do what needs doing. "Talk fast," she said. Voss opened the notebook to the canyon sketch and placed it on the hood of the vehicle. 4 shooters, eastern wall, positions 2 and 4 from the south. Western wall, positions 2 and 3. They're on ledges, not the rim. Suppression is failing because the team is firing 8 meters high. Holt absorbed this. How do you confirm 4 positions from road level? Round groupings, trajectory. The eastern fire comes from 2 distinct elevation points. Look at where the rounds are striking the road surface. Voss's finger traced the lines on the sketch. The trajectory indicates a split. They're not positioned together. They're staggered for crossfire coverage. Pre-planned geometry. Monroe had moved to within earshot. He said without quite intending to say it out loud, "That's not a standard assessment method." "No," Voss said, "it's not." "Black frost," Holt said. "Walk me through it." Controlled retrograde to this point, 40 meters back, to a section of the canyon wall where a natural shelf in the rock face created a partial blind spot from the eastern positions. On the 43rd second interval, eastern position 2 goes into reload. We have 7 seconds. The vehicles move back 40 meters. They reach the blind spot before position 2 cycles back. "The road is covered," Holt said. "Not entirely. The 7-second window is confirmed. I've timed it 3 times. Holt looked at her steadily. "You've been timing their reload since the first shot." It was not a question. The confirmation was already on the page. "From the blind spot," Voss continued, "a fire team goes north through this depression." Her finger traced the dry stream bed along the western wall, a shallow depression, perhaps a meter deep, running parallel to the road for 130 meters. There's a sound corridor. Winds shifted northeast to southwest at 0918. In this terrain, movement in the stream bed will appear to originate from approximately 20 meters east of the actual location. Not perfectly, but enough to delay reaction by 3 to 5 seconds. Monroe looked at Holt. His face was doing what faces do when a recalibration is happening, regardless of whether you've consented to it. The fire team reaches this position. Voss marked a boulder cluster at the western wall base. Direct line of sight to western positions 2 and 3. 1 shot each, both shooters out of the fight. Eastern positions pivot to react. In that pivot window, the convoy moves north. 30 seconds of exposure maximum. They exit the kill zone before eastern positions reacquire. Holt stared at the sketch. The canyon was still firing. Halloran was still bleeding. The clock moved in the direction clocks always move, without sentiment or accommodation. Briggs appeared. He had moved from his cover position without anyone seeing him do it, which was the kind of thing that happened when a man had spent 28 years learning to move through contested space. He looked at Holt. Sir, his voice was level. The math works. I know this terrain. I've run the stream bed before. A pause. She's right about the sound corridor. One sentence. Two sentences. Then he stepped back, because the decision was not his to make, and he knew it. Holt looked at him, then back at the sketch. Then she straightened. Monroe, fire team, you, Briggs, Beaumont, streambed, western wall positions 2 and 3. She turned to Voss. You're coordinating from here. Yes, ma'am. Pruitt, retrograde on Voss's count, 40 meters. When she says move, you move like it matters. Yes, ma'am. Holt looked at Voss one more moment. Something was moving behind her eyes. Something that had begun as resistance and was now becoming something else. Something that had not yet found its name, but was clearly in the process of finding it. Don't let it go wrong, she said. Yes, ma'am. 41 seconds later, on Voss's count, the vehicles moved. The retrograde worked. 7 seconds was not comfortable. It was not the kind of interval that permits relaxation or confidence or any of the mental states that make a dangerous action feel manageable. 7 seconds is the duration of a held breath. It is the time it takes to cross a room at a run, to make a decision, to understand that whatever happens next has already been set in motion and cannot be called back. The vehicles moved back 40 meters in that window with a precision that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with Pruitt's hands and Voss's count and the preparation that had gone into both. They reached the partial blind spot as Eastern Position 2 cycled back into action. The rounds went to the vehicle's previous position. The canyon received the fire and threw the sound in all directions, which meant that for approximately 4 seconds, the enemy did not know where the convoy had gone. 4 seconds. In a canyon, under fire, it was more than enough. In the stream bed, 3 figures moved north in a low crouch. Monroe in front, Briggs behind him, Beaumont covering rear. The stream bed was dry and pale, and about as concealed as terrain gets in the Mojave, which is to say, not much, but enough. The way a single layer of cover is enough if the person using it understands its limitations and plans accordingly. The wind was doing what Voss had said it would do. From the eastern positions, the sound of 3 people moving through the stream bed arrived with a displacement of approximately 20 meters to the east of their actual location. It was not a perfect effect. A trained observer watching directly from the correct angle would have discounted it within seconds. But the eastern positions were managing active fire lanes on a convoy that had just disappeared from its expected location. They were not watching the stream bed, they were watching the road. Monroe covered the distance in 4 minutes. The boulder cluster was exactly where the sketch had placed it, because the sketch had been made from satellite imagery and confirmed against elevation data and was simply an accurate representation of reality that happened to have been produced under conditions most people would not associate with careful cartographic work. He looked up the western wall, found the ledge, the natural horizontal shelf in the rock face, perhaps 2 meters wide, positioned at a break in the stone. He could see the muzzle position from here. He could see the partial silhouette of the shooter at the ledge edge. He keyed his radio. 1 word. Set. Voss's voice came back immediately. On my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark. 2 shots. Western wall. Almost simultaneous, the half-second interval between them so small, it registered as emphasis rather than sequence. Both positions went silent. The eastern positions registered the absence of western fire and paused. A fraction of a second, operationally brief and tactically sufficient. The involuntary hesitation of a coordinated plan encountering an unexpected variable. Holt's voice hit the tactical net. All elements, execute, move north, combat speed. The vehicles accelerated onto the open road. The eastern positions were back on them in 4 seconds. Voss had estimated 3 to 5, the middle of the range. The rounds, now striking the road surface, were hitting it behind the last vehicle in the convoy. Behind, Not through. 30 seconds of exposure. Then the canyon walls opened. The rocks stepped back. The road widened. The flat desert spread ahead of them in all directions, open and entirely indifferent to what had just happened in the narrow passage behind them. The radio came alive with voices. 27 is clear. Lead is clear. 49 is clear. One after another, the confirmations arriving like the inventory of things that had survived. One vehicle had taken a round through the rear quarter panel. Cosmetic. Metal and paint and nothing that mattered. Halloran's arm was the only casualty. The convoy stopped 400 meters north in a wide, dispersed formation. Weapons up. Soldiers doing what trained soldiers do after contact, which is make sure the contact is actually over before they begin the work of understanding what just happened. Voss climbed out of the vehicle. She stood beside it for a moment, looking back at the canyon mouth. The rock was silent. The walls that had been active with fire 2 minutes ago had returned to their geological patience. The long indifference of things that have been here considerably longer than any of the events they've witnessed. Holt was outside her vehicle. She stood there perhaps 15 seconds looking at the canyon before she turned and walked through the dispersed formation toward the second vehicle. She moved without urgency now. The urgency had gone somewhere specific, converted into something that was taking its time, finding its final shape. She stopped beside Voss. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The team moved around them, the organized noise of soldiers establishing security and accounting for personnel. "What are you writing?" Holt said. Voss did not look up. "After action notes, ma'am. The details fade faster than people think." Holt looked at the notebook, then at the woman holding it, then at the canyon mouth behind them, where silence had replaced gunfire with the specific finality of a problem that had been solved. She was still looking when the first mortar round hit, 300 meters south, close enough to hear the impact before the sound fully separated into its component parts. The crack of detonation, the secondary pressure wave, the specific register of indirect fire that every veteran in the formation recognized before the echo finished bouncing off the desert floor. Then the second round, closer. Then the third, closer still. Not the canyon shooters, those positions were neutralized. This was a separate element positioned further back that had been waiting for the convoy to exit the choke point and consolidate in the open. Because an open consolidation point is a predictable target, and predictable targets are the premise of a layered ambush. The canyon was the trigger. This was the hammer. Holt's voice went cold and immediate. "All elements dispersal now. Spread north. Do not cluster. Move." She turned to Voss. Her face had reorganized itself around a new problem, but underneath the operational focus, something else was still running. "Is this part of Black Frost's threat assessment?" Voss was already running the calculation. Not in the notebook, in the space behind her eyes where the work happened before it became visible. "Standard doctrine for this engagement type," she said. "Canyon suppression pulls the QRF to a predictable consolidation point. Indirect fire targets the concentration." A pause. "I calculated the probability before we rolled out." Holt absorbed that. "And you didn't raise it. Raising it would have changed convoy behavior. The ambush team would have read the change. The outcome may have been worse." Something in the set of Holt's jaw changed, just slightly. "How far out is the tube?" "Based on round timing and impact interval, 600 to 800 meters. Mobile element, southeast. Wind drift on the detonations confirms southeast origin." "Can we reach it?" Voss looked at the heavy weapons platform that had arrived with the QRF. The Mark 19 grenade launcher on the forward vehicle. Maximum effective range, 1,500 meters against area targets. "Not directly. We don't need to find the tube. We need to generate enough suppression in the probable position area to make continued fire untenable." The fourth round hit 50 meters east, getting the range. Another 30 seconds and they would have it. Holt looked at her. 1 second. 2. "Briggs." Briggs was already moving. Get on the mount. Iron Wolf is your targeting reference. It was the first time Holt had used the call sign. She did not appear to notice that she'd done it. Perhaps the distinction had already become less important than what the call sign represented, which was a person who knew exactly what she was doing and had known it from before the convoy left the staging area. Voss moved to the Mark 19 vehicle with the economy of motion that people recognize as professional when they have the experience to know what professional looks like. She placed her hand on the mount and oriented it southeast. Bearing 148, 800 meters, 50-meter spread, reference point. She pointed to a rock formation at the desert floor, distinctive enough to anchor a firing solution. Bearing 148, 750, confirm reference. Briggs found the reference, adjusted the mount. Reference confirmed, ready, fire for effect. The Mark 19 opened up, 40-millimeter grenades in a rapid, rhythmic sequence, walking into the target zone with the methodical precision of fire calculated from real data. The sound was flat and heavy and entirely purposeful. The fifth mortar round came in, high, wide west. The sixth was wider still. The rhythm of incoming fire had broken. The timing was off. The tube was moving or suppressed, or both. Then nothing. The silence that followed was the specific silence that follows a solved problem rather than a paused one. The silence of something that is finished. Voss lowered her hand from the mount. She took a slow breath. The first full breath she appeared to have taken in approximately 40 minutes, the kind of breath that a body takes when it has been operating at maximum output and the ground has finally stopped moving. Briggs looked at her sideways. "Nice," he said. This was, from Briggs, a considerable statement. Voss nodded once. She looked at the desert to the southeast, at the place where the mortar had been, which was now just desert. She did not immediately turn away, because Briggs had not moved. He was still 3 meters off her left shoulder, and his stillness had a different quality now, the stillness of a man who has something to say and has decided that now is when it needs to be said. "You don't need to be here, Sergeant," Voss said. "No," he agreed. She waited. 1987, he said. Fort Bragg. He was looking at the desert, not at her. "There was a soldier in my unit, 24 years old, sharpest reader of tactical situations I'd encountered up to that point, or for a good while after. He identified something that needed identifying, reported it correctly through the chain, was told to drop it." He paused. Didn't drop it. Pursued it through channels he wasn't authorized to use. The desert stretched away from them toward where the mortar had been. "He was right," Briggs said. "The system confirmed it 8 months after he was out. Honorable discharge. No path back in. The commendation came through after he'd already been gone long enough that it didn't reach him in any way that mattered." He stopped. "I was a corporal. I watched it happen, and I did not have the clarity or the seniority to do anything about it. I've carried that for 37 years. Voss looked at the desert. "I'm not carrying it for 38, he said. The desert said nothing. It never did. "The review will move now," Voss said. "Yes," Briggs said. "It will." He walked back toward the vehicle perimeter without looking back, in the unhurried way of a man who has said what he came to say and considers the matter settled. Voss stood alone in the desert quiet for a moment. Then she turned. Holt was standing directly behind her. The Major was not looking at the desert. She was looking at Voss. And the way she was looking at her had nothing in common with the way she had looked at her across the staging area 3 weeks ago. Nothing in common with the 2-second assessment and the 4 words in the file filed beneath the threshold of things requiring attention. She was looking at her the way you look at someone you have actually seen, not what you expected to see, not what the paperwork told you was there, the actual person who had been present the entire time. "All clear," Holt said into her radio. Her eyes did not move from Voss. Kestrel Actual responded immediately. "Confirmed. Good work, Iron Wolf." The radio fell silent. The desert stretched away in all directions. flat and indifferent and entirely unchanged by everything that had happened inside it in the last 40 minutes. The Mojave does not care about what just happened to you. This is one of the things veterans understand about desert terrain that civilians never quite grasp from photographs or descriptions. The desert does not adjust itself to human events. It does not register the weight of what occurred inside it. The rock that provided cover an hour ago looks exactly the same now. The sand holds footprints for a while, and then the wind takes them. The sky is the same sky it was before the first shot, and it will be the same sky long after everyone who fired and everyone who was fired at has become part of a different kind of ground entirely. Voss understood this. She had always found it clarifying rather than troubling. The holding position was 2 kilometers north of the canyon mouth, established in a wide, flat area where the terrain provided enough natural dispersion to prevent the kind of vehicle clustering that made a formation attractive to indirect fire. The team had moved into it with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before. Vehicles spread at intervals, weapons oriented outward, the organized stillness of a force that had been through something and was now engaged in the serious work of making sure it was actually over. It was 1047, 40 minutes since the first shot, 28 minutes since the convoy cleared the canyon, 11 minutes since the last mortar round. Voss was sitting on the ground beside the second vehicle with her back against the rear wheel and her notebook open on her knee. She was writing with the focused patience of someone for whom the after-action record was not a formality but a discipline, the conversion of raw experience into usable information before the details began to migrate toward narrative convenience. The team moved around her. Weapons checks, vehicle assessments, the short, clipped conversations of soldiers accounting for the present moment. Nobody approached her directly. Not yet. Briggs appeared from the direction of the QRF vehicles, carrying 2 cups of coffee, with the dedication of someone who has decided that some things remain non-negotiable, regardless of circumstances. He set one on the ground beside Voss without a word and walked away toward the perimeter. Voss looked at the cup, picked it up, drank. She kept writing. The after-action debrief convened at 1400 in the shade of a canvas shelter erected between 2 vehicles. All 12 members of the team plus Captain Philip Storch, the QRF commander, who had arrived with his element at 10:23 and spent the intervening time doing what good commanders do after contact, which is understand what happened before forming conclusions about it. Storch was 41, lean and deliberate, with the particular attentiveness of someone who had learned that listening consistently produced better outcomes than speaking. He asked smart questions. He wrote things down. He did not perform authority because he did not need to. Holt laid out the contact with the methodical precision of someone trained to convert chaos into sequence. The approach, the entry, the ambush initiation, the suppression failure, the Tier 1 contact, the Black Frost execution, the retrograde, the fire team's neutralization of the western positions, the convoy breakout, the secondary mortar element, the Mark 19 suppression. She delivered it cleanly, without the institutional friction that commanders sometimes introduce into after-action accounts, when the account reflects poorly on initial decisions. Storch listened. He wrote. At the end, he looked up from his notes. Casualties. 1, Holt said. Through and through, upper arm, non-critical. Halloran is evaluated and stable. The plan kept it at 1. He said it the way you say something that carries more weight than its surface suggests. Not a compliment, an observation about what the alternative might have looked like. Yes. Whose plan? Holt did not pause. Iron Wolf ran the board. I executed my team's role. No qualification, no subordinating clause, no suggestion that command authority had been maintained throughout in the conventional sense. Just a statement of what had happened, delivered with the same flat precision she brought to every other element of the debrief. Storch's pen stopped moving. He looked at the name on the manifest. checked it against the personnel file, looked down the table to the end, where Voss sat with her notebook closed in front of her, hands resting on the cover, expression neutral. The tactical execution, he said carefully, the timing analysis, the retrograde route, the sound corridor identification, the fire team positioning. That was hers, Holt said. I provided the team, she provided the board. Storch wrote this down with the deliberate attention of someone making sure the record was accurate. He looked at Monroe. Anything to add, Staff Sergeant? Monroe looked at the table for a moment, then at Voss, then back at Storch. The sound corridor assessment was correct, he said. I was in the stream bed. I can confirm the displacement effect was approximately what she calculated. He paused. I wouldn't have known to look for it. Storch nodded, wrote. Specialist Cody Halloran appeared at the edge of the shelter with his arm in a fresh dressing and an expression that combined residual pain with something more complicated. He looked at the group, looked at Voss at the end of the table. Hey, he said. Hey, Voss said. Halloran nodded. The nod had the quality of a man making note of something he intended to carry forward. He took a seat with the deliberateness of someone managing a newly significant arm. That was sufficient. In the economy of what soldiers say to each other about these things, it was a complete statement. Pruitt was the last one out of the shelter when the group dispersed. He had sat through the entire debrief in the third row without speaking because nobody had asked him anything, and he was not the kind of person who spoke without being asked. He stopped beside Voss as the others moved away. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there with the slightly formal quality of someone who has been rehearsing something and is now discovering that the rehearsed version isn't quite right. Passenger side wheel well, he said finally. When we stop, fast, no questions. He said it back to her the way you repeat coordinates to confirm receipt. I didn't ask what we were preparing for. You did your job, Voss said. I drove the retrograde in 7 seconds. Yes, that was the job. That was exactly the job, Voss said. Nobody else in this convoy could have done it in 7 seconds. I needed someone who could. She paused. I put us in that vehicle for a reason. Pruitt looked at her. Something in his face shifted. The expression of a person who has just understood that a thing they did mattered more than they knew while they were doing it. He nodded once, walked back toward the vehicles. Storch lingered after the others dispersed. He exchanged a few words with Holt that Voss didn't hear, then walked to where Voss was standing outside the shelter. He stood beside her for a moment. The review board has been notified of today's action, he said. I imagine the timeline will accelerate. Yes, sir. Is there anything you need in the meantime? She considered the question with the same seriousness she appeared to bring to all questions. No, sir. Storch nodded and walked back toward his vehicles. He understood when a conversation had reached its natural conclusion. Holt did not immediately follow him. She stood at the edge of the canvas shelter with her field tablet and opened Voss's personnel file for the second time that day. The first time had been 3 weeks ago. 2 seconds, certified on paper. This time she read it the way she should have read it then. Slowly. Every field, including the ones that required a second look to understand why they were there. Standard entries through the first section. Transfer orders. The gap where previous unit designation should have appeared, filled instead with a clearance notation that had no business in the file of a private first class. The partially redacted section near the bottom. The language of the reduction order, precise and bureaucratic and, if you read it carefully, structured less like punishment and more like management. Less about wrongdoing and more about a problem that needed to be temporarily contained while a larger question was resolved. Temporary rank reduction per agreement. Per agreement, not per order, meaning Voss had consented to the terms, meaning there had been terms, meaning someone at a level above this file's visible architecture had sat across a table from a 25-year-old soldier and negotiated an arrangement that preserved certain things for both sides. Holt set the tablet down. She found Briggs at the second vehicle, running a post-contact equipment check with the methodical attention he brought to all physical tasks. He did not look up when she approached. He knew she was there. "How long have you known?" she said. He set down the equipment he was checking. "Since day one." He said it without apology. The way she maps terrain while walking, the way she positions in any room, the way she listened to your briefing this morning, not to what you were saying, but to what your assumptions revealed about what you didn't know. He paused. Nobody develops that unless they've spent years in environments where getting it wrong had immediate consequences. "You could have told me." Briggs looked at her with the steady patience of a man who has 28 years of practice at this particular kind of conversation. "With respect, Major, you weren't asking." A pause. "And she wasn't authorized to tell you. The cover assignment had parameters. She was operating within them." "For who was it harder?" Holt said. "Not telling." Briggs was quiet for a moment. The desert filled the silence the way it always did. "That's the right question, sir," he said. He picked up his equipment and resumed the check. The conversation was over, and they both knew it, and neither of them felt the need to confirm it by saying so. Holt stood there for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked toward the eastern edge of the formation, where Voss was standing, and the afternoon heat pressed down on both of them equally, and the canyon was 2 kilometers south and entirely silent. They walked to the eastern edge of the formation, where the desert opened away from the vehicles, and the conversation of the group became background rather than immediate. The afternoon heat pressed down with the intensity of a California desert in September, the kind of heat that has weight and intention and does not negotiate. Holt stopped, looked at the desert for a moment, then she looked at Voss. 11 months ago, she said. "Tell me what happened." It was not asked as an interrogation. It was asked the way a person asks when they want to understand something rather than establish something. The distinction was audible. Voss looked at her steadily. "I was embedded with a special activities unit in Nevada. Forward operations support. We had a convoy route that had been run 17 times without incident." She paused. "I identified an IED pattern in the approach corridor, specific placement signatures that matched a methodology I'd seen documented in 3 previous incidents in 2 other theaters. The pattern suggested the route had been compromised and the next convoy would be targeted." Holt said nothing. "I reported it through the chain of command. The assessment was reviewed and declined. The route was rated clear. The convoy was scheduled to proceed." Another pause. "I had 40 minutes. You acted outside your authorization. I neutralized the IED placement before the convoy moved." Voss's voice was flat and even, the voice of someone describing facts rather than defending a position. 9 personnel completed the route safely. The operation I was embedded with had been running for 4 years. My action exposed the placement methodology to the route team, which the opposition element registered, which compromised the broader operation's security posture. She stopped. "The review board found that my action, while effective in the immediate term, exceeded my authorized scope and created downstream risk that outweighed the immediate benefit." "You disagree with that assessment?" "I disagree that 9 lives constitute an immediate benefit that can be outweighed by operational inconvenience." The words were said without heat. They had the quality of something that had been examined from every angle over a long period of time and had not changed shape under examination. "But I understand why the system ruled as it did. The system protects its ability to function over time, not individual outcomes in individual moments. That's not wrong as a principle. It was wrong in that application. So you accepted the reduction. The alternative was a general court-martial. The reduction was temporary, pending review. The review required documentation of operational performance under pressure." A pause. "Today generates that documentation." Holt was quiet for a moment. You came here knowing this assignment might produce the contact. Black Frost was assigned to this unit when I was embedded here, in case my skill set became relevant. Voss looked at the desert. The canyon approach this morning had a particular signature in the satellite imagery. I assessed the probability at 60 to 70% that it had been prepared. Not confirmed. A reading. You tried to tell me. Yes, ma'am. I shut you down. You were working with available information, ma'am. I had given you none. Raising it formally as a private first class with a demotion on file and no verified background would have produced the result it produced. She paused. If I'd pushed harder and the convoy entered the canyon with a different posture, the ambush teams would have read the change. The outcome may have been worse. Holt looked at her. You calculated that I would shut you down. I assessed the probability as high, ma'am. Yes. A silence between them. The desert filled it with heat and light and the sound of nothing in particular. I was wrong about you, Holt said. It was not an apology. Voss had understood from the moment she met this woman that apology was not in the vocabulary of a person built like Diana Holt. What it was instead was an accounting, the precise acknowledgement of an error, delivered without mitigation and without the performance of remorse. You were working with available information, ma'am, Voss said. The information indicated a private first class with a disciplinary demotion and no verifiable background. The conclusion you drew was reasonable given what you had. I didn't look at you, Holt said. No, ma'am. I looked at a file. I looked at a rank. I looked at a transfer order with redactions I didn't pursue. She exhaled once, a measured breath. I've spent 20 years learning to read terrain. I didn't apply that to personnel. Voss said nothing. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people in the same place, at the same time, understanding the same thing from slightly different positions, which is a kind of agreement that doesn't require words to be confirmed. I'll be running contingency assessments differently going forward, Holt said. More seriously, every file, every redaction. That's a good change, ma'am. Yes, Holt looked at her. I know. They stood for another moment in the heat. Then Holt turned and walked back toward the formation with the measured stride of someone who has said exactly what needed saying and is now returning to the work that remains. Voss watched her go. Then she opened her notebook and wrote 3 lines. Not the after-action record, something else. Private. She closed the notebook before anyone was close enough to see. Briggs found her at the edge of the vehicle perimeter in the mid-afternoon, sitting with her back to the rear wheel, notebook closed on her knee. The desert light had shifted from its midday brutality to the longer angles of late afternoon, which in the Mojave still constituted a form of assault, but a marginally less personal one. He sat down beside her without announcement. This was consistent with how Briggs operated in all things. He arrived when he arrived and did not precede himself with explanation. For a while, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the holding position moved around them. Vehicles, voices, the background noise of a military element doing what military elements do when the immediate problem has been solved, and the longer problems of documentation and accountability and resupply are the primary concerns. The system moves slow, Briggs said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the desert, the direction of the canyon that was no longer visible from here. But today gave it enough to move. Voss considered this. Is that supposed to be comforting? No, he said. It's supposed to be true. She looked at the same direction he was looking. The desert gave nothing back. It never did. It is true, she said. Yes. He stood, looked down at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has said what he came to say and has confirmed that it landed where he intended. You did good work today. It was said with the economy of a man who had never once used a word that didn't need to be there. Just the assessment, delivered cleanly by someone who had been watching long enough to know the difference between good work and its imitation. He walked back toward the perimeter. Voss watched him go and said nothing. At 16:23, Monroe appeared around the front of the vehicle with the particular quality of someone who has been approaching a conversation from a distance for several hours and has finally arrived at it without being entirely sure what to say. He sat on the vehicle's front bumper across from her with the slightly formal posture of someone in unfamiliar social territory. "Iron Wolf," he said. "Monroe," she said. He looked at his hands, then at her. "That sound corridor thing," he said it the way you say something you've been turning over and haven't finished turning. "Where do you learn something like that?" "Terrain analysis, wind pattern behavior in confined spaces, the acoustic physics of canyon environments." She paused. "And time and places where getting the calculation wrong had immediate consequences. I wouldn't have thought to look for it. Most people don't. It's a specific knowledge set from a specific kind of work." Monroe looked at the desert, then back at her. "I said something this morning," he said. "Yes." "In front of the team." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, not performing remorse, processing something real. There was a difference, and Voss, who could read people the way she read terrain, registered the distinction accurately. "I was working from what I had," he said. It came out as something between a statement and a question, which was the honest form of it. "You were," she said, "and what I had was a demotion with no explanation." "That's what the file showed." "Right," he exhaled. "Doesn't make it not a thing I said." "No," she agreed, "it doesn't." They sat with that for a moment. Not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness was the wrong word for something said in ignorance rather than malice. Something more like the acknowledgement of what had been said, and what it had rested on, and what those two things meant when examined honestly by both parties. "You executed the stream bed movement well," Voss said. "The timing was precise. The hold at the boulder cluster was correct." Monroe looked at her. "Good math," she added. Something in his face settled. The specific expression of a man who has been handed the right thing at the right moment and understands, without needing it explained, exactly what it represents. "Yeah," he said. "Good math." He stood, nodded once, walked away. At 1800, Command sent the official summary. Standard language. The architecture of military documentation applied to what had happened in the canyon and in the desert north of it. The contact, the casualties, the neutralization of two hostile elements, the execution of contingency protocol Black Frost, the suppression of the secondary indirect fire element, and one word in the context of tactical management under fire applied to a specific notation. Exceptional. The notation read, "Iron Wolf." Voss read the summary twice on the field tablet Storch had routed to her before his element departed. She set the tablet on the ground beside her. She looked at the word for a moment. Then she looked at the sky. The review board notification came through 20 minutes later. Separate channel, formal language. The action of this date had been assessed as documentation sufficient for the purpose of the pending review. The board would convene at an accelerated date. Rank restoration was the anticipated outcome, pending final deliberation. Temporary, the original order had said. Temporary per agreement. 11 months. She set the tablet down and sat with that for a moment. Not with satisfaction, exactly. With something more precise than satisfaction. The feeling of a calculation that has been running for 11 months, arriving at the number it was always going to arrive at, now that the right data had been entered. She opened her notebook, looked at what she'd written across the day, the timing sequences, the trajectory calculations, the wind data, the sound corridor analysis, the execution sequence and its deviations from projected parameters and the reasons for each deviation. The after-action record, complete. She closed the notebook. The desert night came the way Mojave nights always come, suddenly and completely, the temperature dropping with a speed that seemed disproportionate to the gradual manner in which it had built through the day. The stars emerged the way stars emerge in desert darkness, not gradually but decisively, the sky going from pale to black, and the stars from absent to overwhelming, in what seemed like a single moment of commitment. The team had settled into the quiet that follows controlled violence, not relaxation, the particular stillness of bodies that have been at full output and are now in the process of returning to something resembling a sustainable state. People cleaned weapons, spoke in the short, efficient language of those who had been through something together, and did not need long sentences because everyone present had access to the same reference points. Voss sat apart from the group, not antisocially, at the slight remove that had always been her natural position, but something about it had changed. The remove did not read as isolation anymore. It read as the posture of a person who was comfortable inside her own perimeter, who did not need the proximity of others to establish her relationship to the ground she was standing on. Briggs passed at 2031 and set a fresh cup of coffee on the ground beside her, without breaking stride or turning his head or offering any indication that he had done anything at all. Then he continued to the perimeter check and disappeared into the darkness. Voss looked at the cup. She picked it up. She drank. The night deepened around the holding position. The vehicles were dark shapes against the darker desert. The stars continued their ancient indifference to events below. The canyon was 2 kilometers south and entirely silent, and would be exactly what it had always been when the morning arrived. A narrow passage through elevated ground that had been here before any of them, and would be here long after all of them, without retaining any impression of what had passed through it today or any other day. At 21:43, the radio opened. Tier 1 frequency, the authentication sequence. Then of the sky above the Mojave was the same sky that had been above the canyon this morning when the first shot came, and the canyon walls had turned a single report into something that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The same sky that had been above a facility in Nevada 11 months ago when 9 people completed a route that had been designed to kill them. The same sky, different ground. The ground always changed. The sky above it did not. She set the handset down. She opened her notebook to a new page. The page was white and empty with the quality of a space waiting to receive whatever came next. In the margin, very small, she wrote one word: soon. Then she looked up at the sky. She breathed once, slowly, the full breath of a person who has been operating at the edge of their capacity for a long time, and is now, in this specific moment, in this specific darkness, permitted to simply exist in the place where she is, without calculation, now there was only the desert and the stars and the coffee cooling in her hand, and the words she had written in the margin of a new page, and the knowledge that the system, slow as it was moving in the direction it was always going to move once it had enough information to move there. The radio did not crackle again. It didn't need to. Iron Wolf, stand by. She was. The desert stretched away in all directions, patient, indifferent, exactly what it had always been. And somewhere in the darkness, 2 kilometers south, the canyon waited with the geological patience of things that do not require resolution, that simply exist in the configuration the earth gave them, narrow and high-walled and entirely unchanged by everything that had moved through them today. Everything changes except the terrain and the people who learn to read it. End of Iron Wolf, The Canyon Reckoning. Total, approximately 13,100 words.